cared about, even your health was taken away from you, how hard that would be to trust God and to trust His timing and to trust who He is. It's easy to read it like simply because the Bible is very simple in its language, but there was most likely a lot of emotion that went on. And honestly, that's what Job is. He's going in detail about the emotion that he has because of this. So, Job's friends see that this has happened and they come to offer their sympathy in efforts to bear his burdens. Then practically the rest of the book, like I said, is the dialogue between Job and his friends as they go back and forth. So that brings us to chapter 38. So you could turn to chapter 38. We'll start in verse 1, and this will be where we spend the rest of the time. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, so this is after all the deliberation for 30-some chapters, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it and set bars indoors, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? So Pastor Davian actually did mention this passage briefly in his Bible study, which if you've been coming to that, he's been doing it on the greatness of God. So in a way, this is a piggyback of that because I know that's finishing up this coming week. So I think this will supplement it nicely. So there we have God's response, or part of it. God asking Job all of these questions. I love to read this passage personally. Sometimes when I'm praying and I'm just talking to God, I like to turn to this passage because it reminds me of who God is. I think many times when we pray, and when I pray personally, we forget to remind ourselves of who God is and why He is worthy of praise. That has to be the basis of even our prayers. That has to be what we acknowledge coming into asking God things, is that He is worthy of being praised, and that it's even a privilege that we can ask Him things. So sometimes I forget that, and I just spew all these words that sometimes I don't think too heavily about. And I have to bring myself back to this passage that I love to go to and think, this is who God is, and set my mind right as I continue praying. In Psalm 115, I read this verse. I liked it a lot. It says, not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory. The reminder that God is worthy of praise, and that is where we need to start. Whether it comes to prayer, whether it comes to teaching, whether it comes to worship, whether it comes to our everyday life, that is the foundation. Without that, it is all misaligned. So like I said, remembering who God is the foundation of what we do. When we forget who He is, we forget that He is greater than everything. That is why pastors doing the Bible studies that go through one of God's character traits each session or each lesson that He has, because it is important and foundational to remember all that God is. When we forget, we are bound to run to idols because we think that they are better. When we forget that who God is, we are bound to doubt. We are bound to worry. So like I said, often when praying, we just kind of pray and talk sometimes without much thought to what we say. At least sometimes I do that. Or without thinking about why we may even be praying. But we pray, we serve God, we love God, we do all these things, we spend time with God because He is worthy. And that is why. And I think that a lot of times our walks with God hit walls because we forgot that main point, that we do it because He is worthy, but also because He wants us. How often, for instance, do we remember that His voice shakes mountains? I think we read that in Psalms many times about all these really exaggerated kind of terms about what God can do. But how often do we remember that when it comes to talking to God? Or that He can calm the sea? How often do we remember those when we are praying with Him? So sometimes, like I said, when I'm praying, I will go to this passage to remind myself of who He is and who I am not. Because who am I to be even asking Him of these things? Who are we that God should be mindful of us and care for us? So recently, in my own time with God, I came to this passage, and I was encouraged by this reminder. And if there's anything to take away from today, it is the reminder of God's infiniteness in all situations. For Job, God was giving him that reminder in a very strong way by this questioning that he had. So I have 4 points to us today when it comes to Job and God's reminder to Job. First one is the finiteness of Job. The second one is the infiniteness of God. And then the third is the implications of Job's finiteness and the implications of the infiniteness of God. So I know those words get a little tangled, but we can follow along hopefully. So number 1 is the finiteness of Job in his situation. And we get this from verses 1 through 12. Here God is reminding Job of his finiteness. To be finite, if you just look up a basic definition, means to be bounded or limited. In order to realize God's infiniteness, we must first realize our finiteness. Job was facing trials beyond what most could bear, and as it even says early, he regrets the day that he was born. So even he could barely handle it. In a situation like this, where all things seem to fall apart, he could barely bear it, and he was finite. Things that were happening to him were far beyond the control that he had. If we do not see that we are finite, then we will never give up control of the situation that truly is out of our control. So think of times in your life where there were situations out of your control, and by us taking them in our own hands, which we often do, we are saying that we are not finite. We are saying that we are capable of doing it. So first, God reminds Job that he is finite before he can remind him that he is infinite. Think of Abraham as well. At the very beginning of his situation, like I talked about in a lot of my sermons regarding Abraham, that all of those situations were things that were out of his control, that he could not control, and it required his trust in God to get through them. Job desired a trial with God. In his mind, he was upright, and he wanted to plead his case before the Lord. But the Lord's response was remind him that Job's understanding was not God's understanding. And God reminded Job of this finiteness in 3 different ways. Verses 4 through 6 says, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone?" So we're going to go through these verses, and we are going to see the different ways in which Job was finite, or which Job was bound and limited in a situation. The first one is Job was limited by time. Like it said in the verse, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth?" Job was not there, obviously, because he is bound by time. It points to his limited human nature and his limited human mind. He was born, and he was going to die. He had a start date, and he had an end date. And it applied to his situation. This shows that he was limited by death. He could not see the end from the beginning, obviously. He is not outside of time. He didn't know what led up to his trial he was facing, and he didn't know what was after. And he did not know how it would reconcile. Going back to Abraham too, it applies. Before Abraham ever set out on his journey, he had no idea what led up to this, and he didn't know what would come, but he still went. He was outside time, he was rather bound by time, and being bound by time requires trust in something that is outside of time, and that's what you see with Abraham. Or thinking of a hurricane as well. You know, we experience a lot of those in Florida. If you've lived here long enough, you've had them, some of them worse than others. And it's been a while since I've experienced a really bad one, but I'm sure a lot of you guys can remember them. And in those moments, it's always interesting, in those moments where there's a hurricane, it's really easy to only see the storm that is currently going on. You know, it's kind of hard to remember what sunshine is while it's raining. And then while it's sunshine, it's hard to remember what it's like while it's raining until it rains. Same with something like a headache, maybe, I don't know, or if you've been sick. It's hard to remember when you're sick what it was like before you were sick. It's hard to remember what it felt like to not have a headache while you have a headache, because we are bound by only what we can see and what is right in front of us and in the present. And as Job was the same, he could not. He was bound by time. The next thing that Job was finite in, he was limited in his knowledge. Even if Job was there at the foundation of the earth, and even if he had the ability to be there before the foundation, he lacked the omniscience in order to determine the correct way to do it. As it says, who determined the earth's foundation's measurements? Surely you know, this is verse 5. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? So God is saying, were you there when I laid the foundation of the earth? And even if you were there, who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? What God is asking here, or what God is showing here to Job is your knowledge is limited. So even if you were there, even if you had the ability to be there at the foundation of the earth, you lack the knowledge, and you are limited in knowledge in order to actually understand the measurements, to actually understand what it took to lay the foundation of the earth. It applies to his situation as well. Who is Job to determine what was correct for himself? All that he had, all that we have as limited humans in our knowledge is what is right in front of us. The next is that Job was limited in his power. Verses 8 says, "Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, Thus far shall you come, and no farther, and here shall your proud ways be stayed. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it?" God was reminding Job that he was limited in power. The sea is something, the ocean is something that has always had great power in our minds as humans. Tsunamis are unpredictable and unstoppable. They cause great damage to cities. You've seen it on movies, you've seen it on TV. There's not really much you can do to prevent something like that. Countless stories of boats in the ocean caught during storms getting destroyed, and people dying on the ocean during the storm because of how powerful the ocean is. And even the depths of the ocean are something that we have not fully discovered as humans, something that we cannot fully explore. There are species of animals that we do not even know about. And honestly, humans left to themselves probably could not survive down there because of the things that may be down there. The ocean is something that we cannot contain. We cannot tell it what to do. It has its own will. Same with the hurricane, right? You cannot tell the weather to stop coming. We check the forecast, right? We do that before we do events or outdoor things, like for church when we've done things. I'm sure we check the weather when we're going to the park to do different things like that. We check the forecast not so we can stop the weather that is to come, but so that we can prepare for it. We are at the weather's mercy. There's nothing that we can do to stop it from raining. We can only prepare for what is there. Even something like the rising and the setting of the sun, which is in verse 12. He said, let's read it again. "Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place?" So even something like the rising and the setting of the sun, the new day, we cannot control that. We can only prepare for it. We can wish for a day not to come, but the day will come regardless of what we do. We cannot harness the power of the sun. We cannot tell it when to rise or to set. We are limited to that. Its power is beyond ours. Or think of the laws of nature when it comes to something like gravity. That is something that we cannot bypass. We are limited by gravity. The laws of nature that we think are immovable in our eyes, uncaused by man. And it applies to Job in the same way. Job had the power, in a way, to keep his servants in line, to keep his health in line as far as he could. He could keep his household in line, his animals, his livestock in line. He could organize all of that. But his power was limited. He couldn't make his sores and his sickness that he had go away. He couldn't bring his children back from the dead. Death was more powerful than him. He couldn't stop the bands of people that were killing his servants and livestock. He couldn't erase the day that he was born as he said he wished he could, because it was the Lord who gives and takes away. So Job was limited by time. He was limited in his knowledge of the situation and his knowledge in general. And he was limited in his power over the situation. Job could do nothing for his situation. And a lot of times in our situations like that, we think that we know all we need to know about the situation in order to have a solution. Like I was saying, Job sought to have a trial. He kept saying, Lord, let me make my case for you. In chapter 23, verses 3 to 4, he says, "Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments." He wanted to lay his case to show that he was upright and righteous. According to his understanding, his power, and his knowledge, that was his solution. But his understanding and his power is limited. So that brings us to the infiniteness of God. We talked about the finiteness of Job and or man. Now the infiniteness of God in the situation. So it sounds hopeless when we hear all the ways in which humans, but also Job was limited, right? I think that partly is why he is hopeless, or was some. And that is why we get hopeless in our situations where we feel like there is no way out. But the encouragement is that where we are lacking in power, where we are lacking in knowledge, there is someone who is not lacking in power, and there is someone who is not lacking in knowledge. Same way for the gospel that we have today. That although we are sinful, although we are separated from God, there is someone who is not sinful, and there is someone who is powerful enough to pay for our sins, who loves us enough to pay for our sins. That he is capable and greater than what is in the world. Infinite, conversely to finite, means the quality of being infinite, without bond or limit. So where Job was bounded, and he was bounded by limits, God is without bond or without limit, meaning there is no cap that can be put on who God was. So where Job was bounded, God was not. And let's kind of realize, what this is. God, if you read the whole 4 chapters where God is talking to Job, God poses 77 different questions to Job in the entirety of that. And let's not forget how amazing that is. We may say to ourselves, I think we'd all say this as Christians, that we desire to know God and that we want to know God. And we say, well, how do I know God? How do I know him and draw closer to him? Well, the simple answer is to look at what he says. Here we have 4 chapters of God's literal dialogue to somebody, the God of the universe talking. And think about it as the same as we do as people. Who we are comes out in what we speak. And maybe when you've met a friend, or when you meet a new person, or maybe someone you don't like that much, or maybe a significant other, or whatever, when you first met them, however you want to think about it. Just think about a person when you meet them, you can kind of start to make inferences on who they are based on the things they say, based on the words that they say. You can kind of get a feel on their character just by the words that they're saying, because who they are comes out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So it is the same with God. We can see him in the words that he says, and we can see who he is by the things that he says. So that can be seen in this. When we read those literal words of God, we can see who he is inside of that. So now God is reminding Job how infinite God is. So there are 3 ways that are the same as Job, that God is infinite. He is infinite in regards to time. Like it said in verse 4, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? God was there, and he did lay the foundation of the earth. God is asking Job, if you were not there, and I was, then what makes you think that I haven't seen the beginning and the end of the situation that you are going through? And what makes you think that you have? Because if I am outside of time, then I have seen it. And if you are not, then you have not. So what makes you think that I haven't seen it, if I was there when the foundation of the earth was laid? Next is that God is infinite in knowledge. Verse 5 says, who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? What we see is that in these questions that that God is asking Job, he is both showing that he is infinite and that Job is finite in the same question. Because he is saying, were you there? I laid the foundations of the earth. So by him saying that he laid the foundation of the earth, by him asking this sort of sarcastic question, he is both showing that Job is limited, that God is not, in the same question. So you'll see that the points are similar, but in different ways. So like it said, who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Not only was God there when the foundation was laid, but he knew the requirements for it. We often say flippantly, I think, that God founded the earth. But think about how crazy or amazing that truly is. How amazing was it for God to just know what was required for us? Think of deeply complex cells and how cells work and how the bodies work and molecular science and all this stuff that we probably don't understand. And people dedicate their lives to knowing this stuff. And God created all of that from scratch. He invented it all from nothing. And even when we create things, we base it on things that we already know, things that are already here for us. You think of cooking. When you buy cookies at the store, like the pre-mixed packages, I don't know if you guys have ever done that, but I know I have, where it's like mixed already and it's all together. All you have to do is add eggs and butter and stuff like that. You technically made cookies if you make those, but you made it off of things that were already there. You made it based off of things that were already put for you. But then if you take it a step further, even making cookies from scratch, a lot of us probably wouldn't know how to do it, at least I know I wouldn't. Where you have to, the flour, all of this stuff, you have to do it by yourself, but think about doing it with no recipe, no measurements, no measuring cups, being able to know how to do it without anything. And even then, maybe we could guess how to do it because we've seen cookies, we've tasted cookies, we kind of know what they are. So even if we could throw something together, we're basing it off of something we know that is already there. But imagine having to go even further than that, making all the ingredients from scratch, getting the flour from the wheat yourself, making all of those different things, making the butter yourself, having chickens and getting the eggs yourself. All of these things that we would not know how to do. Imagine that when it is with God. God invented the earth without a blueprint. He knew what it would require for life without anything having been there before. He invented the complex human body that is more advanced than any technology we've created without anything to base it off of, right? You think of something like a smartphone we all have. That smartphone is just an improvement on an older phone, and that older phone is an improvement on another thing. It's all these buildups of technologies that all started with something, but God started with nothing, and He knew how to build it and create it. Amen. So next is, well, that was God was infinite in knowledge. He knew what was required to set the earth in motion. He knew what was needed to make it successful. And like I said many times, we don't even know the simplest things, such as a recipe for cooking. We don't know what is needed. But next, the last thing for God's infiniteness is God was infinite in power. Starting in verse 6, on what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Or who shut in the seas with doors, when it burst out from the womb? When I made clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band. I prescribed limits for its doors, for it, and set bars indoors, and said, thus far you shall come, and no farther, and here shall your proud ways be stayed. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? So I always like to read it. I know it can be a lot sometimes, but I like to reread it before every point because it's a good reminder to get us back into it. So it said here, God's infinite power. It said that He laid the cornerstone. This means that He was the foundation for the foundation of the earth, the cornerstone for the cornerstone of the earth. Everything that we base our life on, God was the foundation for that. Everything that we view as a foundation, God was the foundation for. Like it says in Colossians, all things were made through Him. Without Him, nothing was made that was made. By Him, all things run properly. So if He created it, He also controls it. He controls the sea. As we said, Job could not control the sea. Humans cannot control the power of the ocean, but He controls the sea. Like it said, He tells it where to go. He tells its waves when to go and when not to, and where to stop. He shuts it in with doors. He controls the power of the sea. He tells it where to go. The thing that terrifies us humans, the unpredictability of it, He determines where it goes. And like it said in the verse, He commands the morning and the dawn. He asked Job, have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place? But God determines it. He commands the morning and the dawn to know its place. Things that humans think are uncontrollable, God controls. Things that humans think happen on their own, upon their own will, like the rising sun, God is what determines. Even things like gravity, the laws of nature, the things that we can't change, things we are bound by, those are things that God not only created but commands. But what all does this mean for Job, and what all does it mean for us? So this is the implication of human finiteness. Job was limited to God in all ways. Job is bound by time, and how can he claim to understand the timeline of God's plan, the timeline of the struggle that he was going through? Think of Abraham, think of Joseph. Joseph especially, when he saw these visions and these dreams in prison, and how at the very beginning God gave him these visions that his brothers would be bowing to him. Think about all the struggle that he went through, all the waiting that he went through. If he is limited in time, as Job was, as Abraham was, with, like we talked about my last sermon, with Abraham's son Isaac being born, the whole journey that Abraham went on lasted years and years and years, and he waited years and years and years just to see a glimpse of this promise. Who was Abraham? Who was Job? Who was Joseph to claim to understand the timeline of God's plan if they did not see the beginning and they did not see the end? Our walk with God relies on us realizing that time is not in our control, the when or the how. It meant Job could not trust on his view of time because that only brings despair. If Job is bound in knowledge, how can he claim that God is not working for good? How can he claim that he knows what is best if he doesn't even know the foundation of the earth's requirements? He thought the solution was a trial to plead his innocence. But what God responded with was a revelation of who he was, a reminder of who he was. That was the remedy of the situation. All Job needed was to remember who God was, not who he was. It wasn't necessarily as important that he was righteous or that he was upright, but it was important for him to remember that God was righteous and that God was upright. And if that is true, that trickles down to all other situations, and nothing else really matters. He was to be reminded that God surpasses all situations. And if Job is bound in power, as we talked about, then how can he ask God what he's doing? I even believe that Job's response to God's response was, "Who can say to you, what are you doing?" The trial he faced was beyond his power, as I said. He didn't have power over death. He didn't have power over his body. He didn't have power over the people that came and killed his livestock. It was beyond his power. But with all of these things that seem so hopeless, with our limit in power, with our limit in time, with our limited knowledge, it seems discouraging. And as you saw, Job was discouraged. As you see, we get discouraged in our life. But with that limit that we have, there is hope. Because when we don't have power, there is someone who does. It is the same for us in our life, whether it's our struggles, our sins, our trials. We are limited in our understanding of time. God saw the beginning and the end of whatever it is that we are currently going through, and he is the author and finisher of our faith, as it says in Hebrews, the founder and the finisher. We don't see the end, but he does. If God was there at the foundation, can he not see the end of our situation? If we are bound in knowledge, then who are we to ask what God is doing in our life? And the same as we talked about with the hurricanes, right? We can look at the weather and think that we can get a feel on it, but if you've ever been in a hurricane, you've been maybe locked into your house without power for a couple days. The truth is we don't know when that ends. And it is the same with trials and storms and struggles in our life, is that during it we don't know when it ends, but God knows exactly when it will end. So if God knew from the beginning of time what was needed for life, right? If we are bound in knowledge, then who are we to ask what God is doing in our life, right? God knew from the beginning of time what was needed for life and creation to succeed. As it said, he set the limits, which means he knew, like we hear this a lot, how the earth was perfectly created, right? It's not too close to the sun, it's not too far from the sun. The atmosphere is made up of the perfect amount of chemicals or whatever it is that makes life habitable. It has the perfect amount of water, and as you've seen, people who study space, they haven't found a planet yet that is like it. From the beginning of time, God knew exactly what would be needed for life and creation to succeed. So if that is the case, does he not know what we need? Does he not know what the situation that we have requires? See, in many of our hard situations, we look at what we believe the solution to be. And all of Job's friends even gave their piece on what they thought. And even Job had an idea of what he thought the solution was. And so do we when it comes to our struggles. We think to ourselves, God, this isn't what I need for this situation. We think, God, this isn't how this will be successful. This isn't how things will work out. If this happens, this is not what will cause things to work out. We have this idea of what we think and what we know to be the solution. And we get in our minds that we think the solution to be is, and we get upset when that solution that we wanted doesn't happen. But did we lay the foundation? Are we the cornerstone of what life is? Were we there when the foundation was laid? And if he knew what was the blueprint for a successful earth, if God knew what was the blueprint for a successful earth, doesn't he know the blueprint for our life? In Matthew chapter 6, it says, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you'll eat or what you'll drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air, they neither sow nor reap nor gather in the barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not more valuable than they?" Pastor has mentioned that many times in the past few Bible studies. But it is true, if God was there and he knew what was required for the foundation of the earth, how much more does he know what we need for our life? As Job did, we need to be reminded of our finiteness, of our limits, Because if we do not see our limits, we will never think we need God. And we will always think that we can control our situation. And with that, there truly is no hope. I think of a time in your life where something like that has happened, where maybe you've had a situation where it felt hopeless. And the odds are it was probably because we were basing it in our abilities that we thought. God reminded Job of his finiteness. Be reminded of yours. But with that, be reminded of his infiniteness and be encouraged. And that brings us to the implications of God's infiniteness. If God is outside of time, which we are not, then we know that he knit us together before the foundation of the earth, as it says. He had us in mind, our story in mind. God being outside of time allowed Job to trust that there was more than just the present, right? Because Job was eventually restored. And how on earth would Job have known that that was going to happen, that he would be replaced his things even more so than he had before? God being outside of time allows Job to trust that there was more than just the present. It allows us to see that there is more than the present in our lives. And as I said, whatever struggle we may be facing, it's hard to remember anything but the struggle. It's hard to remember anything but the right now and the here and now. Like I said, with sometimes being sick, I've noticed that for myself. It's like when I'm sick, I can't notice anything else. I can't remember what it was like to not be sick. I just know that I'm sick right now. And that's how it can be with struggles. But knowing God that is outside of time is knowing that there is something different. Knowing that God is outside of time allows us to trust that he has more for the situation. If God is infinite in knowledge, which as we said, humans and Job was not, then he knows what is best. As I said, does he not know? Did God not know that Job was struggling? Did God not know how to fix the simple sores that he had on him? Did God not know even how to bring back the dead if he so chose for Job? It is the same for us in our situations like Job. God knows how to fix it. He knows how to solve it. And he knows what is needed for it. And if what is needed sometimes may not be getting restored exactly the way that Job was, or it may not be restored when Job was. It may require more waiting, but that is trusting that God knows what is needed, not what we think is needed or even what we want. If God is infinite in power, as we said, humans and Job are limited, then he can overcome any problem that we have. He is over the ocean. He tells the sun when to rise, but the sun tells us when to rise, ironically. So if he is over that, then he is greater than any issue we face. As we saw in the book of Job, in the end he was restored. So I'm going to jump to Job 42 at the point where he was restored, and it starts in verse 10. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then came to him all his brothers and sisters and all who had known him before, and ate bread with him in his house. And they showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. And each of them gave him a piece of money and a ring of gold. And the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. And he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He had also 7 sons and 3 daughters, which is what he had before. He called the name of the first daughter Jemimah, and the name of the second Keziah, and the name of the third Karen Happuch, I guess. But if God is not limited in power, then he is not limited to our problem either.
Yes.
If he is not limited in what he could do to fix it, he is not limited in what he can do to fix it, to fix our situation. If God is infinite in power, then God has what it takes to solve whatever issue it is. Job saw his situation and the despair that he had, and he needed to be reminded of who he was, but also who God was. Peter, when walking on the water, needed to be reminded of who he was and his limits, but also who God was in his power. Without realizing that he couldn't walk on water himself, he would not realize that he needed God in order to walk on water. And for us, it is the same. Remind yourself of who you are and let God remind you of who you are and our finiteness and our limits. But then remind yourself of God and his infiniteness and be encouraged by it. When we realize who we aren't and when we realize who God is, no matter the situation, we can be encouraged because he knows more and he has more power and he's outside of the time that we can see. And he can solve it as well. When we believe that we aren't limited, when we believe that we are infinite, we try to be who we aren't. We try to be our own God, and we try to control things that we cannot, which I think is where we find ourselves a lot of the time. but we end up being left hopeless in the middle of a hard life. So what Job said to God, or sorry, what God was telling Job was that you are finite and I am infinite. You are limited and I am not. I have power and you do not, or at least you don't have as much as I do. So if that is the case, then the situation that you are experiencing, Job, is something that I am well capable of handling, and is something that you are not capable of handling. So the same question that Job was asking, that God was asking Job, he is asking us as well today. He is reminding us of who we are, and he is reminding us of who he is as well. So as the music people come up, I'll pray, and just in your hearts and minds, just let yourself be reminded of who God is, but also who you are, and what that means for the situations you have in your life. Because we all know that life is difficult. We all know that there are struggles we have. Maybe it's not as grand as Job's, but even something as small as anxiety or worry or fear could be something that God could be asking you to remind yourself. Am I powerful enough? Do I know enough? And do I see the beginning and the end of it? And the question as well, do you know enough? Are you powerful enough? And do you see the beginning and the end? And the answer is no. But the hope that we have is that when we don't see the beginning and the end, when we don't have the power, when we don't have the knowledge, somebody does. As you saw, Job was restored, and he was brought back to where he was, and God taught him through it. So think about in your own life, think about in just your own situations. Pray, talk to God, think about what it is that he is reminding you of, and let yourself be reminded of it. So I will pray. Dear Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for the reminder of your greatness and your infiniteness. Thank you that that can seep into every one of our situations if we allow it, Lord. And I pray that we get over the pride that we may have of thinking our situations are in our control, or thinking that we have the knowledge to know what is required for our situations to be made well again. Because the truth is, we don't. You know what is required for our situations. So I pray that we would trust you for that in your name.